Welcome, everyone, to Global Conversations Live. I'm your host, Andre Darmanin. And on today's episode, I have the infamous, illustrious Amri Johnson, CEO of Inclusion Wins and author of Reconstructing Inclusion, Making DEI Accessible, Actionable, and Sustainable. But I would be remiss to not throw in a shot today as a Bills fan, since we beat his Kansas City Chiefs last night. So how you feeling, Amri?
I'm feeling great, man. I did not expect to be on here with you. I knew that was the risk when I said yes, but I'll take it. I know we've been having some technical difficulties, so if some folks aren't able to get it, I'm sure you'll be able to make it available for consumption later. And of course, if folks have any questions later, I'm happy to answer them as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I don't know what. Yeah, we'll get the technical difficulties out there and available. So we'll have this recording, at another time, hopefully later on. So let's get started here. So today's discussion, we'll be discussing the future trends and what to look for in EDI and organizational change in 2024 and beyond. But first, let's talk about what we saw this year. So a couple of years ago, the World Economic Forum declared EDI a failure and proposed changing the terminology to belonging, dignity, and justice. Other people are not bringing up equity. Some are taking out diversity as a whole. So then after that, we become loaded with political rhetoric. And we just see pundits and politicians who are riffing on the use of the word justice in the workplace now, too. As we talk about politics here, we're in the U.S., on the U.S. side of things, not so much in Canada or not so much globally. A lot of people were talking about the Supreme Court's recent decision to ban affirmative action in college decisions, which, seem to have some ripples across the globe, but more so in the U.S., I would say. And also, as the Israel-Gaza-Hamas war has shown us in recent weeks, business leaders are under increased pressure to navigate workplace tensions and pressures related to global events. And then finally, what we're starting to see is this EDI, and of course, let me backtrack for a second. We're starting to see this ESG EDI backlash that's existing because of this political strife that's occurring all over the globe and all over the U.S. particularly, but also finally, for political, economic, or personal reasons, many EDI leaders just left their roles. So, Amri, I want to ask you, what are you seeing in your neck of the woods and in your world in terms of what you saw this year in terms of trends?
Well, I think some of it to me is not necessarily a trend, Andre. It's really just an expectation that every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what we saw in terms of the reaction or so-called backlash against DEI, whether it was from the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action in elite colleges and universities, whether it was some of these kind of sensationalist, diatribes about a few people quitting and that was a trend and that means that a lot of people are quitting. The data tells us that we're probably just getting back to where we would have been with a natural trajectory of growth. We're not talking about DEI roles. We just had this spike, 100 and something percentage. I had the numbers at one point. I did a interview with a couple folks before and had the numbers in front of me. I don't have them now, but it was, it's huge growth after the murder of George Floyd. And so I think there was just kind of a market correction that happens all the time. But the reaction from DEI people is, oh, DEI is being attacked. And I think that in and of itself creates another reaction like, okay, it's being attacked. Somebody wants to double down on the attack.
Exactly.
And so it's really a action reaction dynamic. And it's not just happening from those that are opposed to DEI. DEI people are reacting to everything as well. So I think obviously social media exacerbates that. So backlash, I see those trends, but what I more see is people kind of either leaning into what we really reacted to after George
Hmm.
Floyd, or responding and saying, you know what, it is time to evolve our conversation around this space so we can get to where we want to be. And for me, that's always creating the conditions for people to thrive and for the organization to do its best work with principles of inclusion and equity, with principles of understanding the mix of diversity in your organization and dealing with those tensions and complexities. So for me, it's trends are not necessarily trends, are kind of things that I've been seeing for a long time.
Hmm.
And we're reacting to them, and sometimes with not very much, how do you say it? I don't want to just say nuance, but not very much distinctions one from the other so that we can grow the space. We really are just reacting to what we're strongest, we hold strongest, or what's most strongly held for in terms of our practice as practitioners, whether it's social justice or whatever, but we're not
Hmm.
evolving, in my opinion, to the extent that we can, and we're not communicating with each other and debating and even challenging ourselves to the extent that we can. I'll break those down a little bit later, but that's kind of what I'm seeing, is like we're not being as reflective as we can be. We're
Yeah.
reacting just like those who we say are opposed to us, and we're not even thinking about all the things that could, for example, out of affirmative action, what does this create for DEI in practice versus just a reaction about, you know, I saw some meme with the cake with the some of the Supreme Court justices having um, KKK hoods over their heads. I was like, that is not helping, in my opinion, and it's not nuanced, and it's not going to grow the space.
Yeah. And and this is the difficult part of it all, because as you said, there's people who are just stuck in that realm. There are people who are still learning, and who think that change is going to happen overnight, and we need to evolve. And that's the thing. It's evolving is a natural part of the process. And unfortunately, like I said, a lot of people are, and like you said too, a lot of people are just stuck. And the only way this is going to happen is if some people start bringing in, whether it's thought leaders to push them over the not push them over the edge, but push them to get to that next stage. And then after that, it's like, what are we going to do? What are these leaders, or organizational leaders, or et cetera, going to do to get to the next stage? And I don't think they're even ready for that yet. Whether it's because of
Mm,
the politics, right?
yeah, I mean, I think some are ready for it. They don't always
Yeah.
have the language. They don't always have a practitioner with the depth that can look and see how the conversation has evolved internally. Because if the conversation hasn't evolved internally, of course, some senior manager or executive doesn't know how to take it to the next step. They weren't informed with enough of a foundation to even make a leap. You can't
Yeah.
jump from a shaky foundation. And so you have a shaky foundation and then you jump, you risk something that could be quite extreme,
Hmm.
and we've seen what's happened when you go out without a strong foundation. We've
Yeah.
seen the presidents of universities in front of Congress this past week deal with the dynamics between Israel and Hamas,
Hmm.
in the Palestine situation, kind of historically, and not necessarily show up that well, and some to the extent like the Penn president resigning because of it. Now, some
Yeah.
people in the DEI space will say, no, this is a unilateral, white supremacist, anti feminist attack because these people happen to be women,
Yeah.
and they answered in a way that was non-nuanced and not very strong to be very clear about their position, or to not seem like they were condoning behavior that in many other cases they would have condemned on
Yeah.
their campuses. So and so it's a tricky place. Like, people need to have a stronger foundation. I think they're
Yeah.
ready to make the jump, Andre, but the foundation is weak. And we know when foundations are weak. And I'm not talking about just the commoditized information that we've heard around anti-racism the past few years, because that's what everybody's building the case for, and that's perfectly fine, but it's just incomplete.
Yeah.
And so if the foundation was stronger, if we were challenging our own arguments better internally,
Hmm.
then when these conversations came up, we'd see where we are, we'd see where our head is, we'd see where we were strong. But we haven't done that to the extent. You've heard me talk about this. I'm big on truth, and
Yeah.
it means that I do my best to be less wrong. I don't
Hmm.
try to bet my best to be more right. And so I try to be less wrong. And the only way I
Yeah.
can be less wrong is to talk to people that check me, that test me, that give me hard questions, that make me go deeper, which makes me read more, which makes me, you know, humble myself.
Yeah.
so
No, I
so
know.
that's what I think we need to do.
Yeah. And I want to just go to one last thing, and going back to the whole political argument, especially with this, is Israel Hamas thing, and we're starting to see DEI practitioners get in this uh, this web, if you will, of they have their employer, yet they're getting involved in protests and stuff like that. Not to say that there's a free, we shouldn't be protesting, and that's a human right, right? You have the freedom of speech, freedom of protest, but we're starting to see this. People are within the practice who are getting in this little, how do you put it? They're just getting in this mess of deciding, okay, what does their employer say versus what their and especially their communications versus what they're particularly saying, doing in terms of action and stuff like that. So this is something that we're just starting to see, especially over the last 2 months now, because it's a little over 2 months since the raid happened. So what are your thoughts on on that web that's happening, and whatnot?
Let me just make sure I'm hearing you. So people that are working internally in companies and how they're responding to the um, the conflict, and whether they agree with the way their employer is responding or not, they're taking their own initiative to respond.
Yeah,
Sometimes maybe even contradicting their employer's stance.
exactly. Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I mean, look, I believe everybody has a right to say what's on their mind, and
Mhm.
everybody has a right to whatever responses come back at them or reactions that they get. They have to be willing to shoulder that.
Yeah.
Now, if you feel that convicted and you feel like you need to say something, whether it's for Israel or for Palestine, so be it. If you do it in a way that draws criticism or makes you seem like you don't fully understand the depth of this conversation,
Mhm.
then you have to deal with that too. And
Yeah.
so, any kind of dehumanization whatsoever is wrong, it's
Mhm.
bad, it's not okay. And so, if you step into that space where your language, your posture, your response has any semblance of dehumanization,
Mhm.
then you're going to have to deal with the consequences of that. You have a right to free speech, amen. And the world is what it is now, and social media is what it is now. And if you go in and you do something or say something dehumanizing, even on the edge or cusp of it, you're going to have to deal with the backlash. It might be short lived, it might be long lived. You never know. So my answer to that is protest. Say what's on your
Yeah.
mind,
Yeah.
but choose humanity in all of it, and don't choose humanity with an asterisk. Choose
Yeah.
humanity full stop. Like
Yeah.
some people are choosing it with an asterisk, but that's this group, but that's group,
Yeah.
but if you were doing that, but that's incomplete. So my personal belief is I like to stay out of geopolitical entanglements.
Yeah.
There's too many layers and too much complexity to wade in without having a real dialogue, and you don't have
Yeah.
real dialogue on social media. You have
Yeah.
You have groups of people kind of throwing stuff back and forth at each other. I don't think it's helpful, you
Yeah.
know. Um, I think it's hard to have true skin in the game that way too. Like, we're not on the ground there. Most of us have never been on the ground there that are
Yeah.
talking about this
Hmm.
publicly. And if you were on the ground, you might have a totally different conversation going on.
Exactly.
And so, skin in the game, nothing for me without skin in the game. And so
Yeah.
I stay out of geopolitical entanglements. My true skin in the game is humanity. What's happened is horrendous. And I wanted to stop. And it's a lot that is in this mixture.
Yeah.
And I don't think most of us understand the mixture well,
No,
and I
no,
know I don't, you know.
no. Well said, Emery. And yeah, so definitely these are things that we've thought about in this year alone. So now let's move to the conversation of what are we going to see, what we'd like to see, or what we're going to see in 2024 and beyond, especially with regards to EDI, especially with respect to organizations, organizational culture, etc. So let's start with what I finalized with, especially when it came to, or at least one of the points when it came to, you know, DEI practitioners or EDI practitioners, if you will, quitting their jobs or being let go because of it, because of inflation or because of business decisions, etc. So the next part of it is, what is the role? What do you see as the role of DEI within an organization? Whether should it still be a standalone, or is this something that or should it be something that's embedded in the organization, because that's what we're trying to achieve at some point.
Hmm.
So I'm starting to, I used to be that person who would be going out there and saying, look, EDI should not be within HR. It should be within an organization. Top down, leaders should be immersed in that. The position should be, reporting to the CEO of an organization, etc. But now, like we talked about earlier, we're kind of stuck. So how do we get to that next stage? And like I said, in your thoughts, do you think it should be still a standalone given all that's going on, or should it be or are we ready to get to that stage? And when do you think we should get to that next stage?
I guess when I hear standalone, it's more like there's a DEI office, sometimes embedded into HR, sometimes reported into other places. I don't think that that's altogether bad. I think you
Mm-hmm.
need people to to hold the space to almost as a conduit to make the work happen. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't believe that the DEI office should be the center point of the world of DEI and DIA, DIB, DIB, Jedi, whatever it might be. I don't think it should be the center point where things are held there as if this group of people holds all the knowledge of DEI. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a big mistake because it doesn't get embedded into the organizational mind that way. The organizational mind gets embeddedness to happen when what I talk about in reconstructing inclusion is as you create more skilled operators of what I call an inclusion system.
Mm-hmm.
And inclusion systems are just conduits of people who have come together to create the conditions for people to thrive and for the organization to create value beyond just the bottom line. And
Mm-hmm.
so the bottom line financial value it can't really fully be translated. It can't really happen without the people value, the more intrinsic stuff that people feel keeps them there, keeps them wanting to do good work, makes them feel like they're making a contribution and making some coin. I think both
Yeah.
are important, but I don't think one is, in business, nobody would agree with me. I don't think you can have one without the other sustainably so. So should you keep an office of DEI if you want to? But I've
Mm-hmm.
actually been telling people, Andre, you know what? If you're about to hire a DEI officer, just as Adam Grant says, think again,
Yeah.
right? you
Yeah.
might you might think about, all right, you might have a few people that hold part-time this role, you give them enough autonomy, and then the organization has the right amount of unambiguous prioritization, and to for these people to navigate, that they have access to people that are influential in the organization, that they're bringing those influential people to the table. You might have a DEI committee
Mhm.
that kind of holds that space, and these few people are the co-chairs or whatever. You might bring in some externals, and I don't want this to seem like it's an endorsement for the two of us to bring in externals. So I'm just being clear about that. If you have people internally that have the depth, use them,
Yeah,
or you just keep them on a retainer or whatever. But you don't necessarily have to have a DEI officer, particularly if they're by themselves, because
Mhm.
that's what I've seen. Depending on the size of the organization, if you have one and they're by themselves, everybody believes that that's what that person does. And I
Yeah,
think it's that's the isolating piece. It's the piece where a lot of people leave their jobs because they didn't know how to like create the coalitions. They didn't know how to build a community. And if you're alone and you don't know how, you don't have those skills, or you don't feel like you have the agency to take on building community, it's just going to be hard, and you will leave your job soon. But
yeah,
it's both, it takes intellectual rigor, and it takes, feet on the ground. It's a little sales to build
yeah.
community. You gotta build relationships. You have to get people to understand that DEI is about we, not about them.
Hmm.
You gotta help people understand that DEI is not one thing. It's not just representation. That DEI is just actions that create the conditions, and that you need to be in action. And this is not about them. It's about all of us. And so each and every one of us have to be in action, and we have to kind of be critical of what we're doing to see if it's matching or adjacent to the organizational strategy. If you don't bed this into the organizational strategy, into the way power asymmetries show up, the way teams function, reward systems, and of course people experience, where we spend most of our time, it's just not going to be sustained. It will feel good. You might do some good training. You might be feeling really powerful after your training. You unpacked your knapsack or whatever.
Yeah,
Um, but you're not going to sustain it. It's
yeah.
impossible.
So let's go to there's something that's been on my mind as you've been talking here. And one of the things that I'm thinking about are the role of employee resource groups. So that's on the other end of this whole DEI spectrum. So
Hmm.
do you think, part of me thinks that there is a purpose of having these groups, but then maybe I'm a little, jaded, or maybe jaded is not the word, but maybe I'm thinking that they've outlived their outlived their time, if you will.
How dare
Um,
you, Andre? How dare you say these things? But continue.
hey man, I'm just saying what's on my mind, and that's the whole thing. So I mean, you and I are the same way, so so I want to hear your side of the things, man. I want to hear what you think about ERGs and all this stuff. And do you think that in, whether next year or years to come, do you think that this is going to be off to the wayside if we start embedding the principles of
Yeah.
EDI within an organization?
Here's what I believe. I believe in contact over caucus. Now, what does that mean?
Hmm.
You've heard of contact theory or intergroup contact theory. It basically says, and this is research that goes back 50 plus years, so this isn't new. So, and I talk about this in Reconstructing Inclusion. I just don't call it that, the contact over caucus.
Yeah.
But contact means to reduce any kind of intergroup prejudice. You have to have some conditions. One of the conditions is, uh, you have to have equality. Like, you have to believe that you all are on the same level, right? No power asymmetries can exist. People have to know they're on the same level. And I'm not talking about, hierarchical level in the organization, just human to human equality, where somebody doesn't feel like they have power over you. If they have
Mhm.
power with you, that's great, but power over you, no. The second one is you have to be in contact a lot. It's not one or two times. It's a regular engagement with each other, because that also reduces the amount of distinction that you make in a way that's on the surface. You reduce that the more you have time. And I've experienced this personally, right? Then the third one is you have to have a common goal. So you have to know that that goal is consistent and that you're doing that on a regular basis. So you need more contact with people that are equal, that you feel are equals, and you have a common goal that you're trying to fulfill over time. And so if you do that, ERGs are great. But if
Yeah.
ERGs are more caucus, this is my group, and we're going to tell you non-group members what we need because we have our lived experience and we're right. Again, I told you, I'm not trying to be right. I'm trying to be less wrong. If ERGs spend their time trying to be less wrong, contact is the way to do it, because you begin to say, all right, this group has gotten less historically, and we don't always know the full reason. Like, racism is one part of a complex equation. It's not the only thing that gets in your way. you know,
Yeah.
um, I'm black and say that I might get condemned for it, but I know it's not the only thing that gets in your way, because I've experienced racism and I've done all right,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
wildly privileged, so we can go into all that. But a lot of people that are listening to this have pretty high levels of privilege too, because they're on
Yeah.
LinkedIn. If you think about it, who's on LinkedIn? It's less privileged people are
Exactly.
not on LinkedIn for the most part. And
Yeah.
so contact says if you have an ERG, it can't be a single identity for a single identity. It can be of predominantly that identity, but it needs to be for everyone, and that you should intentionally cultivate relationships with people outside of the dominant identity of that group to create contact. If you
Yeah.
do that intentionally, you'll see a lot more, I believe, change and shift in giving people what they need to create the conditions to thrive, more so than when you have people separate and create these caucuses that can have a role and people can feel comfortable about them. But we don't want people just to feel comfortable with folks like themselves. We want people to feel comfortable and build trust with lots of different people, because that's how you build community. Community
Yeah.
is not built in a vacuum. So
Yeah.
that's my belief about ERGs. In the future, I think if we want to do them and do them well, we need to have more contact. And if we
Yeah.
want to stay in caucus, we can. But I think the long term impact of that is a lot of what we're seeing now, because it's hard to see your own blind spots. If you build enough trust for somebody to point out blind spots of your approach or your mindset, and you're open to it, and you've built that trust level with somebody, you're just going
Mhm.
to see something from a perspective that you wouldn't see it, and that's a gift. And I think we haven't done enough of that in ERGs as I've seen it for the most part. I'm personally, I was always against single identity ERGs, and I somewhat
Yeah.
was kind of pushed back against them when I had some power to do something about it. And I think with our ERGs when I was inside were successful, and with my clients, I've been the same. But not everybody believes that. Some people are, very, very wedded to the ways that we've done it historically from the days of IBM's first ERGs. But I think we've seen that works to an extent. And when IBM was doing that, it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Things are different now.
Yeah.
Not dramatically, but enough that we can say contact over content contact over caucus is a better way forward than to stay caucused up and not necessarily engaging with people across all the various similarities and differences that exist in our organization, and allow us to not think that this group, even if they are of a majority affinity, um, are not monoliths. And
Yeah.
you probably have more similar characteristics or other things about yourself that are similar to somebody outside of your group in some cases than you do those who are.
Yeah. And all I go to say to that is the one word intersectionality, right? Because
Sure.
if we're going to continue to silo ourselves in these identity groups and not engage in conversation amongst other groups, you'll never know where you're similar or where you're different. More so similar. And yeah, and I mean that's why I've had a very, maybe it's just my one experience or a couple experiences that I've had with ERGs, and even with this political strife that's going on, where it's the you have to respond to certain situations and stuff, and you're not allowed to, or even the conversations around, like I said, these silent conversations that people are having. It's like, where do we go from here? And at the end of the day, yes, we need to talk to each other, right? And that's what it really boils down to. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
so as we're talking about that, the one thing that really, really interests me, and this is something that I'm seeing that we need to have a trend, and you and I are of the same milk when, as we're talking about similarities here, when we're talking about cultural intelligence here. DI practitioners, what we found is that some are increasingly becoming more culturally intelligent, so are leaders, but that's still a small sample size. So, given the context of how leaders are responding, how equity practitioners are responding, I think we should be going towards a more global approach to this work and understand the cultural differences between regions and how we can work together, effectively and inclusively. So, I'm pretty sure you're going to agree with me on this. And as this trend moves on, what do you think?
No, I mean, my the theory of change for Inclusion Wins and for my work for a long
Yeah.
time before I even started Inclusion Wins was around what I call inclusion system design and development. And inclusion systems design is really focused on your organizational design in a way, and how you kind of make um, inclusion and the practice of inclusion instrumental throughout every part of where your organization does, how it gets on, how your organizational culture gets on, and how things get done, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so when you're designing your organization, if you're designing it and you're looking at your strategy and you've actually included various perspectives in the creation of your strategy, the possibility of people knowing where they stand in the implementation of that strategy is much higher. So the notion of inclusion is not this thing that's just about who gets represented where, or who's at involved in this and that. In this case, it's really, are you doing strategy with people? Are you learning with your colleagues? All the way through how I talked about, power dynamics and how structures and behaviors of those who have power asymmetries at more senior levels in the organization are using that power. Are they using their power to create the conditions for people to thrive? Are they creating as leadership, a la Peter Singh? Um, are they creating the capabilities for a human community to shape its future? Are they practicing leadership with that mindset?
Yeah.
Um, and so if they're doing that, then it will usually influence how their teams behave. It will influence what they reward beyond just hitting numbers
Mm-hmm.
or some arbitrary measurement that people gain. And then, of course, it goes into all of the ways that they engage with people before they enter the organization, while they're there, and after, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's inclusion system design. At the center of that is cultural intelligence. And the reason that I'm big on cultural intelligence, one, I've known David Livermore for quite some time, really early in the Cultural Intelligence Center's evolution. And what I found is like the skill sets of CQ are the skill sets you need to navigate business today. You need to have really good metacognitive skills. You need to have ability to take perspective. You need to have the ability to be, in a way, able to navigate the similarities and differences of a variety of cultural values. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you can't show up and slow down in a way that allows you to build the engagement and understanding of each other, you just can't get stuff done at the pace that you want to, or sometimes ever, because people shut you off, right?
Yeah.
I work throughout the world, And culture exists even when I'm in the US. The cultural dynamics in an office show up just as much sometimes as when I'm in an office that's not in the US. And so
Yeah.
they might manifest themselves a bit differently, but cultural intelligence is relevant across that. So having those skills are all also important. It also ends up influencing our other part of our theory of change, which is around organizational networks. Is because if you don't have the cultural intelligence to engage with somebody across a difference, you never really create a real connection. And so you end up mostly just bonding with people you know instead of bridging with people who are extraordinary that might actually help you move your career more forward more so than somebody that you already know quite well. And
Yeah.
so that's and we don't learn. I mean, that's the biggest risk is that we don't connect because we're not comfortable or we're not skilled, and so we don't learn as fast as we can. And organizations, by and large, whoever learns fastest wins.
Yeah.
So
And
I absolutely agree with you.
yeah. And, you know, and that's the thing. And the one thing that I really think about the most as, as I'm listening to your conversation about metacognition and, and what skills leaders need to have, it goes back to that Deloitte circle that they have in terms of
The
inclusive
six C's,
skills.
yeah,
Yeah.
the six C's,
The
absolutely.
six C,
That's a
right?
it's a
And
classic
cultural
model.
intelligence is part of it.
Juliet Burke. I, I take my hat off to the work she did when she was at Deloitte and the creation of that because
Mhm.
it's timeless. It's
Yeah.
relevant. It will be relevant for years and years.
Yeah, and now it's even more relevant given the fact that we are in this moving pendulum between local and global approaches to EDI, and I
Absolutely,
think
yeah.
that the lines are blurred right now, right?
Yeah.
So
The one thing I would say is I don't necessarily believe in the notion of inclusive leadership
okay,
because there's so many leadership theories out there. Um, I believe leadership is leadership, and if you're not inclusive in your approach, you're not in the game of leadership.
yeah,
Now, there's people who have been very senior executives, or you can call them leaders or what have you, and historically, but in the 21st century, inclusive leadership, in my opinion, is just it's redundant. It is leadership.
yeah,
There's no like non-inclusive opposite of inclusive leadership. You can go
yeah,
into servant leadership. You can go into um, uh, transformational leadership. We can go down, work around high fits. I mean, there's so many different leadership theories,
yeah.
but inclusive leadership to me is redundant and it's built into most of the other ones that I believe are viable and in practice they actually do what organizations need to do is create the conditions for people to thrive and for the organization to create immense value.
Definitely, definitely, and you know, let's go on that notion, if you will, not necessarily on leadership, but I think going kind of full circle with what we're talking about here. You and I both know we've talked incessantly about class and mobility. And I've always wondered why social mobility, I should say, and we've always wondered why it's never been a conversation starter within the practice within EDI itself. And one of the articles that really set the tone for that just recently was that um, the Harvard Business Review article on the forgotten dimensions of diversity, where the authors specifically talk about class being part of EDI. And given the current state of the economy with inflation, the cost of housing rising in large global cities, in Europe, in Asia, in Canada, U.S., etc., this is what organizations should be, and EDI professionals should be paying attention to this more so in 2024 and beyond. So, I guess you know, I think you and I have had the conversation off to the side about why equity practitioners don't talk about this. Is it because they're not knowledgeable of this, or is it because they're for whatever reason it is, they need to start paying attention to this more so. And I'm starting to see the conversation happening in the UK, but still it hasn't reached the US, and the class dichotomies are there. You can even bring in the whole caste conversation that Isabel Wilkinson has done with her book. And of course, because they interrelate to class as well. And it's not just related to South Asian culture. So,
Mm-hmm.
all of that to be said, where do we go from here when it comes to these conversations? In your head, do you think that this is a conversation that we need to have from now on as being part of that EDI framework,
I
if you
think
will?
I actually think it always has been, and you're right.
Mhm.
We haven't talked about it as much as we can. There have been some good books that have come out around this. I'm remiss because I meant to find and because I was looking through my Kindle and I didn't have time to get to them. But there were two or three books that I took on and I read parts of over the past year. One was from a brother in the UK that talks about the difference between how diversity shows up in the UK versus in the other parts of the Anglosphere. And I really resonated with that because um, he talks about these distinctions in the UK between people who immigrated to the United Kingdom from the Caribbean versus those who are immigrants from the African continent directly, and or they had they're one or two generations forward. So it's an
Mhm.
interesting conversation where what I see, and when I've seen the data, and I did some work for a pharmaceutical company earlier this year, and I got a chance to look into the health outcomes data for blacks in the UK, and I couldn't reduce blacks to a category of blacks because when
Mhm.
I pulled out the category of people who are um, Nigerian or West African or even East African, South African, and the data for Africans, people of African descent in the UK, as far as healthcare outcomes and sometimes income, is higher than that of many British whites.
Mhm.
And so, like, what does that mean? Now, for those from the Caribbean, it's different. There is disparity. Now, what is that? We can say some of those same things with people from the Caribbean in the US that have done extremely well.
Mhm.
So the notion of racial reductionism is one that I think is going to bite us if it's not already biting us. And if we move to talking and understanding class, which a lot of classic uh, liberals have focused on in the past, the new ways that we look at this, the liberal mindset or Democrats or whatever, it's been this more kind of uh, identity politics more so than it has been understanding class at the intersection. So,
Mhm.
what do I think we need to address it? Do we need to understand it better as practitioners? We have to do our homework. We have to do our reading. We have to grow our capacity to engage in this conversation. I think some have, some haven't. I think we need to think about equity upstream in terms of those disparities, and that when you do that, when you talk about class, you actually create more solidarity. Most of the people that have been revolutionaries that have been killed, they got killed not because of their stance on their particular racial group. They got killed because they were bringing together the most marginalized amongst multiple groups,
Mhm.
right? And
Exactly.
people and the people that's a threat because when you bring that's where for some people that kind of are in this mindset of power and control, when you start bringing together large numbers of marginalized people across differences, they start seeing that their similarity is that they have to fight for something that they believe is meaningful, and that's oftentimes when you have the biggest changes. Civil rights movement didn't happen just because blacks marched.
Yeah.
It happened because they were marching on behalf of a lot of people who were marginalized, and some people with privilege put their privilege on the line to do it with them. So
Yeah.
there's a space where I feel like we haven't made that happen to the extent that we have could. And if we talk about class, I think we would bring more people into the conversation, in my belief, in a meaningful way and a more sustainable one.
Yeah. No, I hear you. And And that's something that, that we need to have more of a conversation, especially, with organizations having their role and how that's going to change not only their culture, but their way of doing business.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
And so one last thought as we're talking about changing business and for the future, and we're talking about the future is now, and and shaping our organizations faster than what we think, and that is AI. You know, AI, we've talked about it from ChatGPT to eliminating hiring bias and whatnot. And it's gotten to the point now, just recently in the Financial Times, they reported that the EU just came out with a set of regulations for AI, where they talked about having a actual human interest at the forefront of this of their regulation and whatnot. So, in terms of shaping organizations and shaping the way the cultures are, and of course, let's put to the side even to the the framework for EDI, EDIP, EJ, whatever, all those bloody acronyms. Anyway, where do how do I see it shaping out as this is going to really revolutionize AI. And actually, let me go back for something too, because I just saw a post just this morning before I got on was about how the OpenAI platform is getting lazier because of the fact I guess partially because there's so many requests it can't handle everything. So you're getting a lot of feedback saying that that we can't do this request for because there's so many resources and stuff like that. So that maybe it's clogging the system and whatnot. But anyway, I digress. All of that being said, where do you think AI or how AI is going to shape organizations as a whole?
um, I mean, obviously, it's already been shaping them for quite some time, and so
Mm-hmm.
we didn't, we didn't just because we have large language models available to the public doesn't mean we haven't had them for a while. I saw some
Mm-hmm.
of the earlier usage of chat bots. They were good. They had
Mm-hmm.
limits. Like I know IBM was using chat bots around talent development and internal mobility for quite some time. This is pre 2010. Like they were up to this for a minute, and it was helpful. So there's some applications that I think are quite helpful, but I think the best and the most robust applications are not going to be kind of large language models that are publicly distributed. They're going to be companies that utilize the technology of large language models and train them on their own stuff. And if they can keep it in house, that's where you have the biggest opportunity because there are some things that machines should be doing. When you have a
Yeah.
lot of data, you need to, and you have a lot of it, and you can analyze a lot of it at one time. You need big computer models, and this is a little bit of Gerd Gingerizer's work. But if you have things that are not so certain, that we don't necessarily know that well, that are a lot more ambiguous, then we should be using human intuition.
Mm-hmm.
I think we grow better that way by sense making amongst humans, just like allowing the machine doing the work. So I think human intuition, sense making is a better tool to in most things that are complex than just large language models are. So my answer is we're not going back. It's like, what do we do going forward? How do we use it most responsibly? Who do we listen to? Are we just listening to the founders and the people that want to make a lot of money? Or are we listening to, Dr. Gebru and a bunch of others who have been out there saying, hey, look, we can do this. We're not against it, but let's do it
Mm-hmm.
responsibly. And I think those researchers, those scholars, those technologists, if we're listening and we're having robust conversations, we can do well and do good at the same time. So they can make their
Yeah.
money, and we can still do good. And as I say in reconstructing inclusion, we can also pass the Terminator test So you saw in Terminator 2 where Arnold came back and he was a helping Terminator. He wasn't just
Yeah.
trying to kill everybody. He was trying to
Yeah.
protect
Mm-hmm.
the person who would lead the revolution into the future. And so I think if we can pass the Terminator test and choose humanity in these decisions moving forward, we'll do great. If organizations start using this to manipulate or to be over, then I think it will be a disaster in the making. And there will be some people that think that way. Hopefully, there's just enough counterforce to oppose it.
Yeah, and you know, I'm gonna full circle end this conversation with the fact that in moving from 2024 and beyond, I'm gonna take your phrase. Two words: choose humanity. That's all
Amen.
we got to do, right?
Amen.
That's all we got
Amen.
to do in terms of whether it comes with AI, whether it comes to, you know, breaking down those class barriers, where it becomes, you know, looking at a local versus global approach to EDI, or, you know, how it all shapes up in organizations. This is where we need to be, and we need to be humans, and looking after each other at the end of the day. So, any last words before we close it off, Amri? Besides the fact that the Chiefs are playoff
I
bound
knew it
and
was
stuff, but
coming. I knew that we definitely have come full circle now. No, Andre, thank you. It's always a pleasure. I hope this is helpful to folks. And, choosing humanity means we're very clear that we're interdependent.
yeah,
And there is no goal on being less wrong. And that means kind of reflecting and choosing humanity in our decisions, in our actions, in our way that we engage with each other. I